It is the single most popular dog breed in the English-speaking world, registered by the millions, chosen again and again as the default family dog, the default guide dog, the default detection dog at airports and police checkpoints. Walk into almost any veterinary waiting room, any dog park, any suburban backyard, and there is a reasonable chance the dog staring back at you is some version of this breed. Calm, eager, endlessly food-motivated, and buried inside a meaningful share of that beloved population is a literal mutation in a single gene that quietly rewires how hungry the dog feels, all day, every day, regardless of how recently or how much it just ate. This is not a training problem. It is not a personality quirk owners imagine because their dog begs dramatically at dinner. It is a documented, published genetic finding, and it explains a behavior millions of owners have lived with for years without ever knowing there was an actual biological reason behind it. First, the study that named the culprit. In 2016, researchers at the University of Cambridge published findings identifying a specific deletion in a gene called POMC, found in a significant share of Labrador Retrievers tested, roughly 1 in 4 dogs in the study sample. The research team had originally set out simply trying to understand why Labradors, despite living in households that varied enormously in feeding habits and exercise routines, still ended up overweight at such a consistently higher rate than most other breeds. And the gene deletion turned out to be a far more satisfying answer than diet alone could ever provide. Dogs carrying this deletion were, on average, measurably heavier and showed significantly stronger food-motivated behavior than Labradors without it, even when researchers controlled for how much exercise and how much food each dog was actually getting, ruling out the obvious explanations owners usually reach for first, like a lazier dog or an owner who simply overfeeds. The gene itself was not some obscure footnote. It sat at the center of a well-understood biological pathway already studied for decades in other species, including humans, which is exactly why the finding mattered so much once researchers connected the dots between a known mechanism and a famously food-obsessed dog breed. Second, what that gene is actually supposed to do. POMC produces a precursor molecule that the body cuts into several smaller, biologically active hormones, some of which travel to the brain specifically to signal satiety, the feeling of having eaten enough. In a dog with a normal, fully functioning copy of the gene, finishing a meal triggers that signal, and the urgent drive to find more food gradually fades until the next mealtime approaches. In a dog carrying the deletion identified in the Cambridge study, that signaling pathway is measurably disrupted, meaning the brain receives a weaker, less convincing message that the meal just eaten was actually enough. The dog is not lying about feeling hungry. Its own internal signaling system genuinely never quite finishes telling its brain that the hunger has been addressed, which means from the dog's own perspective, every meal genuinely does feel incomplete, no matter how large the portion actually was. Third, the detail buried inside the data that made the finding even stranger. When researchers compared ordinary pet Labradors to Labradors specifically bred and trained for assistance and guide dog work, the deletion turned up at a noticeably higher rate in the working dog population. One plausible explanation researchers raised is that decades of selecting Labradors, specifically for trainability, intense food motivation, is one of the most reliable tools handlers use to shape behavior through reward-based training, may have inadvertently selected for the very mutation that makes the dog perpetually hungry, without anyone involved in the breeding process ever knowing the genetic mechanism they were reinforcing. In effect, generations of breeders chasing the most trainable, most food-responsive puppies in every litter may have been quietly concentrating a hunger-signaling mutation into exactly the bloodlines, doing the most important, most visible work. A genuinely unintended consequence of selecting for one trait without realizing it was biologically tangled up with another. Fourth, the part where the flaw becomes a professional asset. Trainers working with food-driven dogs will tell you plainly that a dog who finds every single treat genuinely thrilling, no matter how many it has already received that session, is dramatically easier to train through repetition than a dog who loses interest in food rewards after a few successful repetitions. Service dog and detection dog programs lean heavily on consistent, high-value food reinforcement to shape complex behaviors over months of training, sometimes thousands of individual repetitions, before a single complex task is considered reliable. And a dog whose own brain chemistry keeps treating every single piece of kibble as genuinely exciting is, from a pure training efficiency standpoint, an unusually convenient animal to work with. The same biological quirk that drives a pet Labrador to counter-surf for scraps at home may be quietly responsible for why the breed dominates so many working dog programs in the first place. An accidental overlap between a household nuisance and a professional advantage that almost nobody connects until the genetics are spelled out explicitly. Fifth, the part nobody explains at the breeder's table when a puppy goes home. The breed's modern working history begins much earlier than the POMC discovery, with the Labrador's ancestors developed in Newfoundland, Canada, as the St. John's water dog, a working breed used by fishermen to retrieve nets, fetch fish that slipped overboard, and haul fishing lines through cold coastal water for hours at a stretch, often working alongside the fishing crew through entire shifts in conditions that demanded real stamina and total indifference to cold water. Webbed feet, a dense, water-resistant double coat, and a thick, otter-like tail used almost like a rudder while swimming were all selected specifically for that demanding, freezing job, long before anyone called the breed a Labrador or imagined it lounging on a living room floor. English sportsmen encountered the breed in the early 19th century, brought examples back to Britain, and refined the modern Labrador Retriever breed standard there, somewhat ironically naming the dog after the Labrador region of Canada, despite its actual origin lying in Newfoundland, a geographic mix-up that stuck permanently once kennel clubs formalized the name in the early 20th century. Sixth, the cost that shows up on a vet's scale, not in a research paper. Whatever the precise genetic mechanism, Labradors consistently rank among the dog breeds most commonly diagnosed as overweight or obese, a pattern veterinarians link directly to the breed's intense, near-constant food motivation, combined with how often owners interpret that motivation as evidence the dog is simply still hungry, rather than a behavioral pattern with a documented biological driver. Excess weight in dogs carries the same kinds of downstream consequences it carries in humans: increased joint strain, elevated risk of diabetes, reduced mobility, and on average, a measurably shorter lifespan than a dog kept at a healthy weight for its frame. Veterinarians treating overweight Labradors frequently describe the same frustrating pattern. Owners genuinely love their dog and want to do right by it, interpret persistent begging as a sign of real hunger rather than a documented genetic quirk, and end up reinforcing the exact problem they are trying to solve, one well-meaning extra treat at a time. A breed bred for generations to retrieve tirelessly through cold water now spends a meaningful share of its life managing the consequences of an appetite its own genetics never learned to switch off. Seventh, a second genetic curiosity hiding in the same breed, this time tied to coat color rather than appetite. A study examining veterinary health records across a large sample of Labradors found that chocolate-coated dogs had a measurably shorter median lifespan than their black and yellow littermates, along with higher rates of certain ear and skin infections. Chocolate remains the rarest of the breed's 3 standard coat colors, the result of a less common combination of 2 separate color genes, and researchers raised the possibility that the smaller historical breeding population behind the chocolate color may have concentrated other, less visible health-related genetics along with it, the same way a small founding population can narrow a gene pool in any breed. It is a separate finding from the POMC discovery entirely, involving a different gene and a different outcome, but it points at the same underlying theme. A breed this popular, with this much genetic data collected on it over the decades, keeps turning up hidden technical details that have nothing to do with how the dog looks or behaves on the surface. 8th, what responsible ownership actually looks like once you know the mechanism. Veterinarians who treat the breed regularly recommend strict portion control, measured by weight rather than by how convincingly the dog begs. Regular weigh-ins to catch slow weight gain before it becomes a medical problem, and redirecting some of that intense food drive into structured training games and food puzzles rather than simply free-feeding or handing over extra treats to quiet the begging. Some veterinary clinics now offer genetic testing specifically for the POMC deletion, giving owners a concrete answer rather than a guess about whether their dog's begging reflects a documented biological pattern or simply inconsistent feeding habits at home. None of this requires expensive intervention beyond the test itself. It requires owners understanding that a Labrador's dramatic interest in food is not a behavioral failure to correct through willpower alone, on the dog's part or the owner's, but a documented physiological signal running quietly underneath all of it, one that responds far better to structure and measured portion than to guilt or frustration. 9th, the reframe worth remembering the next time a Labrador stares, unblinking, at your dinner plate. That stare is not manipulation in the way people usually mean the word, and it is not a training failure either. For a meaningful share of the breed, it is the closest thing to a literal cry from a brain that genuinely never finished receiving the message that the last meal was enough. The same intense food drive that makes the breed extraordinarily easy to train, reliable to work with, and beloved by millions of families is, underneath the surface, partly a documented genetic quirk in a hormone signaling pathway, quietly running in the background of one of the most popular dogs on the planet, completely unnoticed by most of the people living with it every single day, right up until a veterinarian or a research paper finally puts a name to what they had been calling just a Labrador thing for years. The next time a Labrador refuses to believe it has already been fed, remember that for roughly 1 in 4 of them, that refusal isn't a personality trait you're failing to correct. It's a gene quietly arguing with its own brain. And so far, the gene is winning.